Hello, my name is Andrew, and at present I work at several universities in the Kansai region, as well as doing a number of freelance classes, some of which are on Saturday, which is the reason I've made this video in advance. So apologies for not doing this live today. Now, the topic of my presentation today is online translation in student work. And I just want to start by laying my cards on the table and being upfront and saying that if anybody is watching this and expecting to be given some news about a new and exciting app or piece of software that is going to enable you to understand, identify when students have used online translation in their work, indisputably foolproof evidence, then I'm afraid you might be disappointed because that's unfortunately not the way this presentation is going to pan out. What I do hope to discuss today is first of all the advance and improvement of online translation, especially over the past year, and how I think this will impact on the way we assess students. As an example, say for example you have student A and student B, and student A has written the story of what they did over the summer holidays in Japanese, and then they have translated it using Google Translate, and it's taken them less than 5 seconds to translate it. And then you have student B, who has written a similar standard of essay, but they have used their own English skill, and they spent around 2 hours editing it, planning it, etc. And both students have submitted it and got a similar grade. Now, extend that to the end of the year, and imagine that both students have finished university with similar grades and they go for similar jobs, and student A and student B have interviews on the same day, and the student who used Google Translate, and it took them 5 seconds, gets the job, and the job involves using English. So first of all, I think that's unfair on the company, and I think it's also dishonest in terms of how we assess students. We want to be assessing students as fairly as possible. Now, this isn't to say that I'm completely against online teaching, online translation, far from it. Freudian slip there, some may say. What I am against is the wholesale translation of a body of text, like I just mentioned, students copying and pasting something they've written in the L1 into the L2. Yeah, the kind of lazy way of doing your homework, I guess. I think online translation has its place in the classroom, and I think the presentation following mine will go into more detail about that. So I'm sure that will be interesting to watch. The second thing I want to talk about is some of the red flags that I was made aware of when doing my own investigation last year. In my own study, I had 5 Japanese volunteers who were kind enough to translate a story. So 5 different stories translated by 5 different volunteers. And each story came with a pair story, which was the same story, but translated using Google Translate. So the job of the native speakers, of whom there were 17, was to ascertain which of the translations was student translation and which of the translations was done by Google Translate. And the follow-up was to ask them to just give some pointers as to what influenced their decision. And a couple of things became apparent, amongst others, one of which was passive voice. So Google Translate seems to struggle somewhat with passive voice, or it uses it excessively, also incorrectly, a lot of the time. The other red flag I noticed was participant use, or pronoun use, if you prefer. I'm going to go into this in more detail as my presentation goes on. But to give an example, one of the stories which I'll be showing you later is about a panda that was born in Tokyo. And I think because the translation software couldn't decide the correct reading of the kanji characters of the name of the panda, the name of the panda subsequently changed several times as the story went on. So I think that's quite an interesting red flag. Also, I think it struggles to ascertain who the protagonist of the story is, because I can change to we, can change to they, to he, to she, etc. as the story goes on, which is quite confusing in terms of your train of thought. So there's a bit of guesswork going on when you look at these translations. And yeah, I think it is one of the stumbling blocks that online translation has, more of which on later. Now, this all relates to something called syntactic ambiguity, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more of as the presentation goes on. I'll just give you an example of my own from, I believe it was last year, when a student submitted an essay and they were talking about their pet dog and how they loved their pet dog. And one of the lines was something along the lines of, I love the texture of my dog's meatballs. So I thought this was quite strange, texture of your dog's meatballs. So this sentence continued to haunt me for several days later. I kept thinking about this. Why on earth would the student talk about their dog's meatballs? All these different ideas came into my mind, as I'm sure you can imagine. It was only when I did a search, I think using an online dictionary or online translation tool, that I realized that if you break down niku-kyu in Japanese, it makes perfect sense. Niku, meat, kyu meaning a sphere or ball, but it also refers to the pads on the soles of a dog's paw. So whether it's the pads or the paw specifically, I'm not entirely sure, but it's splitting hairs to start talking about that in too much detail. The main point was that because Google Translate and these other translation software tools don't live in the real world, they don't have access to this cultural knowledge that we do. So they almost like taking a stab in the dark and not wanting to anthropomorphize, but it's almost like they struggle to ascertain the correct word use, especially the correct pronoun use. Anyway, I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to move into the main body of my presentation. So if you just bear with me a second. Here we go. So the topic of my presentation, machine translation and student work, as we have already established. What is the running joke? Well, let's have a look. Machine translation is just 5 years away from being indistinguishable from human translation as it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago and on and on. So there's this idea that machine translation, or online translation is about to become perfect and it's going to pass the Turing test. And all this good news is just a few years away. So that's the running joke. Another joke that relates to online translation is this idea that it's just terrible. And a lot of people still have this idea from seeing T-shirts in Japan with mangled translations, which throw up all kinds of unusual English. And there's a Facebook group where people post examples of these terrible translations. And it all adds to this idea that online translation is a joke. The most recent example was the government's campaign telling, I believe it was the government, there was a campaign in Japan anyway, where people were being told to stay positive over Christmas. Well, given the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic, being positive or staying positive is possibly not the best advice you should be giving people right now. So let's move on. I just want to draw your attention to this statistic. Chap in South Korea, Briggs, found that almost 60% of Korean students I believe it was his students, so not the entire population of all the students in South Korea, strongly agreed that they don't need to learn to write English because they can simply use online translation. So quite a worrying statistic, I think, when you think about the difference between the cognitive effort and the scaffolding, etc., that goes hand in hand with using pen and paper, using old-fashioned methods like just using a dictionary and your own knowledge and asking the teacher, scaffolding through a more knowledgeable other. I think online translation as a more knowledgeable other is a step too far, because I think the problem is that you're basically outsourcing mental effort to the algorithm or the software rather than doing the work yourself. So why not allow translation? So not a point I want to dwell on for too long. Both machine translation and L2 speakers of English can reasonably be expected to produce output inferior to that of an educated L1 speaker of English. So the point here is that both online translation and student work can be reasonably expected to have a certain level of errors, whether that's in the degree of lexical density, lexical cohesion, the grammar, spelling, etc. There are going to be mistakes, and we can reasonably expect that online translation will also have mistakes. Although, of course, as online translation gets better and better, this will tend to be less the case. So I'm just going to show you this quote from the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. Just give you a second to read that. So basically, what they're saying is that students need to be able to use technology, harness technology in order to get their message across. And I agree with this. I just don't agree with what I mentioned before, which is the outsourcing of mental effort to online translation. But I do think it has a place in the classroom. Also, the second argument against not using machine translation is that it merely reflects the advancement of technology. For example, in the same way as the calculator freed students up from having to use paper and pen to solve mathematical problems, or indeed the invention of paper. So when paper came along, of course, the oral tradition of passing on knowledge through presentations, for example, standing in speaker's corner as the Greeks did, and information being conveyed through word of mouth and memory. So paper was criticized. So the main point being that when a new technology comes along, it's generally criticized. But I think online translation is a little different, and I'll explain why. So in order to make this point, I'm just going to show you something that Bar Hillel, writing in 1952, pointed out. So have a look at this. The pen is in the box, and we have the box is in the pen. So the point here, the rhetorical point, is that no translation program would be able to ascertain whether the subject was in fact a pen for writing or a child's playpen or a pig pen, for example. Excuse me. So the broader point is that unless we have access to the culture of the real world, unless we have the corporeality of a human body that allows us to interact with the world, to read, to have the exophoric references, if you like, that allow us to see the broader context, it's difficult to ascertain which pen this sentence is talking about. As I mentioned before, exophoric references refer to something outside of a text. So if, for example, this sentence were placed in a paragraph about somebody working on a farm, we could quite reasonably expect that the pen was talking about a pig pen or a sheep pen, and not, for example, a giant novelty pen that somebody had bought from a joke shop. But of course, the internet or any software used for online translation doesn't have the same cultural knowledge as humans do. So this is one of the stumbling blocks. And we can refer to this as syntactic ambiguity. Another example I have here is I saw the killer on the tower with the telescope. So we have a prepositional phrase and it's modified, but we need to understand, we need to ascertain how is it modified? Are we talking about the killer holding a telescope, or are we talking about the subject I seeing the killer through a telescope? So the main point here is that this could indeed be from a story, and the story could be something like the telescope killer of Osaka, and it could be a series of short stories about a killer who is walking the streets of Osaka with a heavy telescope which they use to bludgeon their victims to death. Or it could simply be that the person saw a killer on a tower and they used a telescope to do this. And if we have the exoteric references, if we have that information, we are able to do so. Another problem is metonymy. So have a look at this sentence. While driving, John swerved and hit a tree. John-san wa jitenshi ni notte iru toki ni michi kara sorete ki ni butsukatta. So I'm just going to show you some examples of different translation tools. And as you read through these, you can see that the quality goes from what I would consider to be very good to fairly good to what I'd consider to be the bargain bin, of translation. So the quality of translation really depends on the translation tool you use. The ambiguity here is that we need to ascertain, is it John that hit a tree or is it John's car? Well, of course, as humans, we know that it was John's car, and it's highly unlikely that John got out of his car and punched the tree. But of course, a computer doesn't have access to this cultural information. It's merely using the words as broken down into their constituent parts to translate the information. So I just want to show you something that became apparent in my own study, as I mentioned before, which is incorrect participant identification. So this was a story about somebody who was drowning, and they took off their trousers and inflated them and tied knots in the bottom of each trouser leg. So quite an interesting story. But as you can see, the protagonist is identified as I here, and I'm glad, and men, when it should be the man. So I thought this was quite a good example of how Google Translate can't really seem to understand who the protagonist of a story is. And just referring back to the story of the panda I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, the panda's name is something like Saihammer, although the name changed several times during the story itself. I think because Google Translate couldn't understand which reading of the kanji characters to use. And here we find that the panda is playing with my mother. Well, I believe the panda was playing with its own mother, not my mother, or indeed the person who wrote the story's mother. Right, so I just want to show you a quick extract of something that was translated, a story that was chosen at random and just translated by deepl.com. So I'll give you a second to look at this. So the point I want to make here is I would consider this to be a very good paragraph. And as I say, it was just picked at random, but I think it could have been translated by a native speaker, right? So I think we need to consider how the quality of translations is getting to this standard, and that if our students find out about this technology, we'll soon be giving every student an A. So when should you become suspicious, and what to do about it? Well, what you do about it if you discover a student has used online translation is entirely up to you. But an excessive use of the passive voice and incorrect use is something I noticed. Participants changing or not reflecting the subject of the clause as mentioned, maybe if it seems to be too good to be true. So what you can do is try to make assignments that are tailored to your students as individuals, of course. Now, finally, I just want to pose a quick question and ask you, how do you think these were translated? Okay. So as an example, one person is Japanese by this technological concert. So already we can see that this is a kind of word salad. One person spoke, I want to eat Chinese food, and others spoke, I want to buy souvenirs to the AI. By the way, this is a story about Mitsubishi's translation technology that allows you to translate 10 languages simultaneously. And then at number 3, we have at the presentation of this technology, one person said in Japanese, I want to eat Chinese food, and the other said in English, I want to buy a souvenir at the same time. So it can deal with multiple inputs and multiple outputs as well. So kind of short on time, so I'm just going to move ahead and I'll give you the answers shortly. Thanks for watching, and remember, go easy on your students if you suspect online translation has been used. And here are the answers. Extract 1, the word salad, is excite.com. Extract 2 is a Japanese friend with a TOEIC score of 750. And extract 3 is Deep L. So that's the end of my presentation. So I want to thank you very much for watching, and I'm going to take questions. Thank you.